afternoon or good morning to everyone who is attending our Wednesday webinar here at TimeSolv. I am Scott Clayson, the Marketing Director at TimeSolv, and I'm going to be your host today for another edition, our December edition, our holiday edition of our Wednesday webinar. So thanks everyone for joining. To recap, again, the purpose of these webinars and why you're here today, even though we send out tip of the weeks to all of firm owners and administrators of TimeSolv, generally almost every Monday morning, we know that ongoing education sometimes involves seeing things in action rather than reading about them. We're all different types of learners, so that's why we do these Wednesday webinars. And we do these now on the second Wednesday of every month. We used to do it the first Wednesday of the month, but based on feedback we got from the one we did in November, many of you voiced a legitimate concern in that, hey, you know what, the beginning of the month is when I'm doing a lot of my heavy lifting in TimeSolv, generating invoices. It's my busiest time of the month. And I was like, duh, yeah, Scott, that makes sense. That wouldn't be a great time. So we decided to move it to the second Wednesday of the month. So if you guys all want to mark your calendars now, we'll be doing the next one at the same time, 1 o'clock Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific time on Wednesday, January 10th. And again, we cover the topics from the previous month, basically, that we sent out our tip of the weeks on. And in this case, since the last webinar that we did was on November 1st, we actually have 6 tips that have come out since the last webinar. So generally it'll be about 4 or 5 topics a month. So some housekeeping items before we get started. I do plan on this webinar lasting, again, about 45 to 60 minutes, depending on how many questions you might have as we go through this. I am recording this session, so if you need to duck out early for whatever reason, I will be sending an email later today, possibly tomorrow morning, with a link where you can listen back to the webinar, and we'll also post it on our YouTube channel, the TimeSolv YouTube channel. So speaking of question and answers, everyone is on mute here for this webinar, and we will do a Q&A session, a typed in Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And as I've mentioned this to many people who've joined before, I like to do this because the questions you might have at the time might get answered 2 or 3 minutes down the road by me. So if you notice at the top of your screen, you have several kind of little bubbles that are part of this join.me web browser window that you have open. And the one that has the little dialogue bubble, if you will, looks like, something Charlie Brown might have dialogue in. If you click on that, that's where you can type questions into when we get to that portion of this webinar. And I'll try to do my best to answer them. If they get a little too in-depth, remember I'm the marketing guy, not the support guy, so I might have to get back to you later if I can't answer the question for you at the time. And others are always welcome to chime in if they know the answers. A lot of you are, you're in TimeSolv using it every single day in depth, and you might have some tips and tricks that even I don't know about as somebody who's not a power user like you guys are. So, okay, so without further ado, let's get started with today's webinar. So we have 6 topics, like I mentioned, that we're going to cover in the next 45 minutes to an hour. First, and actually, before we even do this, I want to tell you, how do we come up with these topics for the tip of the week that we send out? And it basically comes down to this. I go to our support staff every week and I ask them to check their call logs, to check the emails that came into support, and tell me, like, what's bubbling to the surface? What are you getting, what you feel like is a higher volume of questions about? Is there certain topics? And there's usually generally never a time where we're stumped and we have to really think long and hard about a tip of the week we need to send out. So all of these tips are because there's been enough questions asked from our existing client base that we know we need to cover this topic once again. So our 6 topics today. How are you going to issue a credit memo to your clients when you need to do that? Pretty simple steps. It's very similar to when you actually allocate payments or make payments for an invoice, essentially just the opposite. And then there are many instances where you want an additional recipient to receive the invoice via email. How do we do that? Where does it get done? We'll show you how that happens. Then a brief tip, but one that's important because we do get this call a lot, changing the session timeout duration. When you have logged into TimeSolv, but you have not done any activity for a certain period of time, you will get logged out. So how do you change that from the default settings? We will show you. Then it might seem like a simple thing for those that know the ins and outs of using QuickBooks and other things, but the difference between an invoice and a statement is a question that's come up enough times that we felt it warranted having its own tip of the week. So we'll just go over some of the basics of the difference between an invoice and a statement. And then we also want to talk about another feature that I feel like is a bit underutilized within TimeSolv, and that is our dashboard that allows you at a quick glance to track how you're basically doing in hitting some of the targets you may have set, specifically how many billable hours you want to make sure you have put in over the course of the year, how much money is being collected, are you altering your rates too often, and so on. So we'll show you that. And then the last thing is how to create custom rates on task codes. Again, a question that comes up frequently enough that you may not or your lawyers may not charge the same exact rate depending on the work that they're doing. Maybe they're going to court and they charge a different rate when they're in court than if they're doing research or whatever it might be. So we'll show you where you can do that. So that is going to cover today's webinar. So tip number one, let's get right to it. How to issue a credit memo to your clients. So we'll walk through first how you actually create the credit. Then you need to allocate it to a specific invoice, or you can spread it out over multiple invoices, and then you can see that credit on the statement of account or a sent invoice. So let's open up and get to TimeSolv here. So when you want to create a credit memo, for whatever reason, somebody's overpaid on an invoice and you need to issue a credit to them, you want to head over to the payments section here of TimeSolv, go under payments, and then again to the payments link. Obviously you want to choose the date that you want to issue the credit memo. By default it's going to be today. And let's choose a client and specific matter. In this case I'm going to do, say, Riverview Cafe deed filing. By default, normally we're entering payments here. We're recording payments here. This time though we're going to do a credit memo. And if you notice, the payment method has now changed. We're not doing an external trust transfer. That's a whole different ball of wax. We're doing an internal credit memo. And then you can generally ignore this reference field. You probably don't need to use it. That's generally for if you're recording like a check number or something like that. Not real applicable here. Not a required field. And then you just type in the amount. Here we'll say it's going to be $500. And this is a note where you can obviously lay down why are you issuing this credit memo. Client overpaid on invoice last sent, whatever it might be. Okay, and we're going to hit save. Now if you notice, that credit memo showed up down here, and it's just going to live there until you do something with it. You need to allocate that just like you allocate a payment. This is a pretty similar way in which you record payments as well. It's just kind of doing the opposite. You're issuing a credit instead of issuing a payment against an invoice. So to allocate that credit memo, you click on allocate here. And by default, if you have multiple matters for this client, in this case, this Riverview Cafe deed filing, this is the only matter that I have for this particular client. If you had a client that had multiple matters, they would all show up here. And to get to the one that you want to specifically allocate a credit to, you could just simply uncheck this box here. Now in this case it doesn't do anything for me because I only have that one matter. But you can see I have 3 invoices here, two that were sent in August and another that was sent in September. And we could do several things here, just like when we allocate payments. We could spread that credit memo out across these 3 invoices, compute equal proportions. As you could see, it would break it down into that $500 into the proportion to what the balance is. Or to make it simpler, and what most people end up doing is they really just want to allocate a credit memo to one particular invoice. So in this case, we're just going to check the box here that we want to allocate it towards invoice number 148, and we're just going to hit allocate here. Oh, this payment amount was actually what when I computed it. So let's go back. Let's go back to that, and now we can say let's just allocate $500 against this $4,750 balance due and hit save. and it's now been allocated. If you then generate a statement to show that credit memo, or even if you go to the sent invoice, so let's go find invoice 140 here. Actually, no, sorry, it was 148. This Riverview Cafe deed filing. Here's what the amount was, $47.50. But you can see the balance now is $42.50. That $500 credit that we've allocated has already been placed on this sent invoice. So if you wanted to resend the invoice again to show that, you could do that right here. We're just going to simply download this sent invoice again. There it is, just downloaded. Here's the PDF for it. And on our statement, it's showing that $500 was applied to that invoice 148. Now, the reason why it's showing it as of today's date is it has to do with our invoice templates and our invoice settings. If you go under invoice to settings and you set up your billing template, and we're using this flexible billing template, when we click on that and go to our statement of account page, notice that we're computing the balance as of the current date. Now that invoice, as you saw, was sent back in September. If we wanted to do the statement of account, which is what you saw on that second page basically, as of the current invoice date, then it would not have showed it because you just did that credit memo today. So by default, it shows the statement of account will compute by the current date right now. So that's why it's a great thing where if you want to do a credit memo and reissue that invoice again to the client, you can do it, by default, it's going to show it by today and you can resend it again. So that's essentially what you can end up doing if you want to issue a credit memo. If you have a credit that you want to issue, but you want to apply it to a future invoice, if you will, you can do that. You can just have, go ahead and make that, create that credit, and then it can just sit. And it can sit down here and not be allocated. And then when you send your next invoice, you can apply a credit to that, resend it, and go from there. The other thing, of course, that's very easy to do if you so choose is on the draft invoice itself. And we've gone over this before in some of other tips. If you have a draft invoice and you need to credit, apply a credit to it from something in the past, you can always come in here, click on the dollar amount, go over to your totals tab, put in what the adjustment's going to be. I'm going to take $500 off, and this is, a credit adjustment for May, or whatever it might be. Okay, you can call whatever you want, and you can save that. And then when we go back to our draft invoices, I think it was this one right here that we just did, and we go to, let's view it by clicking on that little icon there, the little magnifying glass icon. If you guys don't use that for viewing your draft invoices, great tool. Sometimes I need to do this twice on my particular browser, it seems. You will be able to see that you made that credit adjustment. You can see right here, credit adjustment for May, $500. So there's different ways you can do it. Some people like to have that credit placed in the payments section to kind of make it more official for reporting and so on. Okay, so let's go on to tip number 2. Adding multiple email recipients to invoices. So what are some scenarios where this can be used, and when do you want to add the additional recipients at the client level versus the matter level? So first of all, you might very well, quite often in fact, come across, I can think of 2 scenarios immediately in which you'd want an additional email to be or invoice to be sent to an additional email address. One is you simply have a client who they want a copy of the invoice emailed to them, but they also need to have one sent directly to their accounts receivable department, their accounting department, whatever it might be. So both parties have a copy of the invoice. The other time in which you may want to add an additional email to receive the invoice is if the timekeeper, say you're at a bigger firm, you can set, and I'll show you in a little bit, where the main email that's for the account administrator or the owner of the account, TimeSolv account, can have the invoices emailed to them as well, CC'd to them. But that doesn't help you if you're like one of the lawyers or timekeepers and you want to see a copy of the invoices too. that would be a time where you could, for your clients and matters, add your email address to the field where I'll show you, and you would then get that email as well. So it's very simple. To add additional emails when you send these invoices, you go under Clients and Matters. Good place to start. Go to the client. Let's do Landry and Company, for example. And then we just click on the Invoice Settings tab. And then you have the field here, Additional Emails. If you need to add more than one, just do a comma, space, and then add the additional email. You don't need to do a return where they're listed in a column of any sort. Just keep adding the emails. Your own email, if you're the timekeeper and you want to get a copy of the invoice and you're not the main account owner of TimeSolv, would be the best place to do this. Just so you know, if you do this at the client level, that means that invoices for any matters, again, if you have multiple matters for this particular client, all of those invoices, no matter what the matter is, would be sent to this additional emails that you enter. If you want to send, and perhaps you're working for a larger company, as a client of yours, and they have many departments and the various matters in each department, you got to send it to different places. You would go to the specific matter level here, click on the matter, click on invoice settings, and then put the additional email here. So now this additional email would only be sent to for that specific matter for that client. So that should make sense. You always think of TimeSolv, it's a hierarchy type of permissions. Anything that's at the client level will run first. If there's nothing set at the client level, it'll run up to the client level. In this case, if you set no additional emails at the matter level here, it would run up to the client level. Are there any set for the client? Well, yes, there is. They're going to get that invoice sent to them as well, and so on. So it's a pretty simple thing. Like I said, if you are the account, let's go under account to our account. The owner, whoever started the account with TimeSolv, is the person who is considered the firm owner, and their information is what is in this section. And this email is the main email that we send communications to as the owners. If you want to make sure that this email gets CC'd on all emails or all invoices that are emailed, you would go under Invoices to Settings. And then down here at the bottom on this General tab, you would just click on Copy Invoice Emails to Sender or Copy Statement Emails to Sender. So by checking these boxes, invoices when you send them by email are always going to be CC'd to this email address. So you wouldn't have to do it for every single client and matter if you're a solo, for example. But again, if you're like a 5-6 person, whatever, number of timekeepers you have, and those timekeepers want to see the invoices too, maybe they're in charge of collection, then that's where you would set in the invoice settings of each client or matter their email address. Okay? So hopefully that's pretty clear for everybody. So on to tip number 3. This is a pretty quick one, changing the session timeout feature. So this offers a way that, and we do this for security purposes, that if you're logged into TimeSolv in a web browser and you are inactive by default for 30 minutes, the next time you try to do anything, you'll be logged out and you'll have to log back in again. And we do have a lot of people who kind of call into support and say, God, how do I fix that? I just want to have TimeSolv open in the background all day, and I may not be using it immediately, but I just don't have to log in all the time. Now, if you're running a timer, like you're on a phone call for 45 minutes or something, then because the timer is running, I believe you will still stay logged in. But if you do want to change that default, we're going to show you where to do that. And I do caution that maybe use this with discretion. If you're using TimeSolv at a computer that is in a public area, somebody's, a receptionist, front desk, whatever it might be, we would really obviously advocate for security reasons to keep that setting at a half hour. And if you really do feel like, hey, I got to have TimeSolv up all day long, perhaps use our TimeSync tool, that widget that sits on your desktop. And we've covered that in some previous Wednesday webinars, that allows you to track time and expenses right from that tool. And you don't even have to have the web browser open. Or Conversely, of course, you can always use your cell phone and the mobile app on either Android or iPhone to log the time and expenses in that fashion too over the long course of the day. But if you really do want to change it within TimeSolv itself, you would go under Account to Settings. And then down here, about 2/3 of the way down the screen, you'll see Session Timeout Duration in hours. And by default, it's set to 0.5 or 30 minutes. And hopefully you've noticed this too, by the way. If you hover over any one of these fields, you'll generally get a longer description of what that field is for. And this is where you could change it to whatever your little heart contents, 8 hours, 10 hours, an hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever it might be, so that you would stay logged in even if you were inactive for that period of time. And then you just click Save, and that updates it. And again, by default, it's 30 minutes. Okay? So a quick tip, but one that we do get a lot of calls on. So just be aware of that. And this is for everyone within TimeSolv. This is your account settings. You can't set it by professional. So you can't go into a specific timekeeper and tell them, well, they're only going to get 30 minutes, but this other person's going to get an hour and a half or whatever it might be. Whatever you set at the account level. This is why you need to be a little more careful about it, especially if you're a larger firm where there's a lot of timekeepers. You just think long and hard about changing that to something that's perhaps a little longer, because that will be in effect for every one of your users, both support users and your timekeepers, in which the inactivity will not log you out if you change it to whatever you want it to change to. Okay, so an important kind of little safety tip, I guess. Okay, on to tip number 4. Excuse me. So this might seem simplistic. What's the difference between an invoice and a statement? But again, we got enough calls on this question that we felt it was worth doing a tip of the week. And it can get, I know, a little bit confusing, because by default, you can include a statement of account with every invoice that you send. But really, that's just, again, it's just showing you where your client is at as far as their balance goes. But they're not interchangeable terms, and statements don't have to be included with invoices, and we'll show you where to take care of that. But again, invoicing, it's about collecting payment. You're sending something to a client because you expect payment in return, and it's going to have all of the itemized details of the work that was done. I'm assuming most people do include the granular, like time entries, expense entries, whatever it might be, that build that invoice into its final amount. There's also, invoices have a remittance page that can be submitted if people are submitting payment by check, and so on. Statements, of course, they're just sent out to let clients know where they stand and to remind them that they need to pay. And it just basically serves as an account summary for a particular point in time. Generally, statements of accounts are not as comprehensive as an invoice. It's not going to show you all the itemized time entries for every single invoice that you've sent them. Okay, so that's basically the main differences. So let's take a look at the places. First of all, hopefully you know where to generate an invoice, or excuse me, a statement, and that is under Invoices and Statements. Yes, seems obvious. And then you click on over here, New Statements, and you can even include any client that has a zero balance. So they don't owe anything to you, but perhaps they need it for whatever, for their records or whatever it might be. And then you can also set that if there has not been an invoice sent from a particular period of time, you want to give them time to pay. So by default, it's from a week previous, saying that if you send an invoice on December 6th or more recently, like yesterday, the day before yesterday, that won't be included in the statement here that's being generated, because they really probably haven't had a lot of time to digest the invoice, pay the invoice, and so on. So you don't want to necessarily include that. And you can change that to whatever you want. If you want it to be today's date, you can make it today's date. But by default, we set it from a week prior to whenever the day is that you're going in here and creating those statements. So then you're just going to create the statements here, and you can hear some of the zero balances that we have. If you sent a statement previously, it'll tell you the date that you last sent the statement. It'll also show you when you last sent an invoice. And then again, you can send these out just like you send out invoices. Either you can print them, which essentially means downloading them as a PDF and then printing. You can send them via email. You can even take advantage of our auto mail feature and we'll mail it for you. But when you go ahead and download these statements, and we'll do it as a PDF here to view, it's going to be rather simplistic. It's just going to basically show, hey, here's invoice number 150. Here's the amount. There's been nothing applied. As far as the payment goes, you still owe us $6,322.50. Very simple stuff. Okay, that's your statement of account. Now, many people have asked, well, what kind of template do these statements follow? Okay, like what's going to be, what can I put on or off of these statements and not necessarily the invoice? To do that, you need to go over to invoices and down to settings. Then you go back to your flexible template where we were at before. By default, when you issue a statement of account, it's going to use whatever billing template you've set at the client level. Okay, so when you go over here to Clients and Matters, you're viewing a client, you have invoice settings here, and this is the default billing template you've chosen for this client. It's going to pull from your client level. In some cases, some people might have a different billing template at the matter level. Not sure what scenario, but that could happen. It has happened, but not a lot. But when you're generating a statement of account, by default, it's a statement of the entire client's work you've done for that client. So it's going to pull from the client setting here. Okay. So you can manipulate what's going to be seen on that statement by going to that template itself and editing it. So we'll go over to flexible templates. Again, we went to invoices, we went to settings. Now we're at flexible templates. We're clicking on flexible billing template, and then we have a whole tab, statement of account page. And this you can check on or off what you want to include on your statement of account page. By checking this box here means that statement of account page gets produced with the invoice. A lot of people don't like to send a statement of account with every invoice, and they'll uncheck this box. Even if you uncheck this box and you generate a statement, it's going to use the settings that you had created. So if you want more or less or whatever on a statement that you generally don't send with an invoice, you have to come in here, check this box, turn it on basically, say I want to do this, I want to do it as of the current invoice date, whatever, I want to include everything, I'm going to have just everything on here. But you still don't want it to show up on an invoice, so just go back, just uncheck this, and it won't be included on an invoice, but it will be the template that's used when you generate a statement, a standalone statement. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, we'll just hit update here. And now because I did turn on so many things, and you'll notice every time I come back here, it's not like draft invoices that just get held. You have to either do something with them, or the next time you come in here, they're going to be, you have to do it again. Okay, so let's create these again, and let's download that same Landry and Company. And it probably is going to have more information on it because I included check everything. So let's take a look. Yeah, you can see this has all the details that you would, for every single matter that I do with this Landry and Company. I have the Plano Road apartment construction, I have real estate title work, and it's showing me all the details, transactions, payment that was applied, and so on and so forth. So it gives me the totals. Yeah, so that's just a way to handle what you want on the statements of account that might be independent of the invoices. Okay, hope that's clear to everybody. Okay, so let's move on to our next tip. Using the TimeSolv dashboard has multiple benefits. This dashboard, as I'm going to show you, and you may have played around with it at some point in time. Something that, especially for administrators or managing partners, those who are in charge of making sure that the associates or whoever it may be are on track for meeting their goals for the year. This is a great tool for them to use. So let's go and take a look at it here and where it can be located. So it's over here at the far left-hand corner, you probably don't use it a lot, dashboard. Yeah, makes sense. First of all, you got to make sure most people have this turned on, but if you can go over here to settings and enable the dashboard is down here. Make sure if you don't see dashboard here, you need to come over to the account settings as, of course, an admin person, and you can turn this on, enable dashboard. When you first land here on the dashboard, you have two kind of windows that you're looking at. I have set the target billable hours in this red of what I want each of my timekeepers to make sure they bill over the course of the year. By default, it's a year. Generally, I believe most law firms ask that their associates or lawyers bill around 1,600 hours. That's the goal. That's the target. What this shows you at a quick glance is what are the actual total hours that has been entered and how many billable hours have been entered. Because we know, again, best practices for time tracking, every person who's a timekeeper should be tracking all of their time, not just their billable time. That's a huge thing we've covered in past, webinars, that it's a good exercise that even if they are doing things that aren't going to be billed to a client, they track that time so that the firm can get a good look at how much time is actually being spent on billable work. So this is a good place where you can see that, and you can see it broken down when you hover over it by each month. It's a great, quick, easy tool to see if you're on track. You have two other things you can track at this high level. The amount that you've billed, the target billable amount, essentially takes a person's default rate, multiplies it by the hours that you've set for the year, and that's the target. And then again, you'll be able to see how much have they actually billed, and more importantly, how much has actually been collected. So if you have each timekeeper is responsible for perhaps collection, and they have, this blue line is way above this kind of orange line, there's a problem. So a quick way of identifying the problem. And then you can also look at billing rate. Are they deviating from their billing rate more often than they should? Are they dropping their rate for discounts? Are they, charging too much? Whatever it might be, okay? At the admin level, you can see these three things for every single one of your timekeepers. You can simply click here, and I have these 7 timekeepers here, or 6 timekeepers here. You can also go into past years to see how they did versus last year. To change the settings around, you just simply go under dashboard to settings. And this is where you can allow your people to view the dashboard here. You can turn off the target billing rate if you'd like by just simply unchecking this. If we uncheck that, you'll notice that as I hit save, everybody will go back to 0. And this is where you can set your target hours for whatever your time period is. If you want to see just by quarter what their target hours and target billing rate is, then you can simply go in here and change it to the dates that you want. Okay? And then you could put in here everybody's target billing rate. This is where you can play around with the settings and determine, maybe I'm just going to do 400 hours. And you could go under general here and say, my target billable hours is 400. My fiscal year starts in January. Okay, that's fine. Let's go over here to targets and permissions, and our target hours, as you can see by default, is 400, and I'm going to change this to the quarter. And yes, you'd have to go in and then change this each additional quarter. It doesn't default to new dates once that quarter or time period is over. You do have to manually manipulate that, and then you can go back and do this for various years. Okay, so it's a really nice high-level way of, am I on track? Again, TimeSolv is about, we want to give you as much clarity into how your firm is performing as possible. And you'll notice here, by the way, since I didn't set any target billable hours or hours, there's nothing here. Okay, I don't have a target. I just have actual versus actual total hours, actual billable hours. But this is just a great way to. Sorry, I did have it, but it was only 400 hours. A great way to see, like at a snapshot, how am I doing with the firm? Okay, so that's why we think it's really something that if you guys aren't using this tool, hey, wow, it's a new year starting. Obviously in a couple of weeks, start using it. Put in target hours for the year. I want 1,600 hours from all of these associates. That's the default. And then they can quickly come in and see, how are you doing? Are you on track for the year? And if not, let's adjust. Let's do that. So let's turn it on. Let's give everybody's target billing rate 200, let's say, 225, 250, 225, 200, and 180, because Dennis Thurman is just a para or whatever. I don't know, a new associate. Okay. So I encourage you guys to start thinking about using this next year, as 2018 is right around the corner. Okay, so that's how we set it up. That's the benefits of using our dashboard, and give it a shot. Our last tip of our webinar is going to be creating custom rates on task codes. We'll talk about why you would need them, how to create the rates for the task codes, and how to assign that task rate first, essentially for every client and or matter that this affects. One of the strongest features of TimeSolv that really differentiates us from a lot of other billing and timekeeping systems is our rate flexibility. You can get about as granular as you can possibly think of when it comes to setting rates. And this is kind of one of those cases where you can change the default rate for timekeepers depending on the task they're working on, depending on perhaps even the client or the matter they're working on. You can even get so granular that for the same exact task, for the same exact matter, two different associates have a different rate for that task, for that matter, for that client, if you so choose. Now that's getting pretty deep in the weeds, but it is possible within TimeSolv. But a common question we do get is, how do I change the rates on a specific task code? And it's common because you might, especially if you're doing leads filing and building an electronic bill, where you have to change you decide you charge a different rate for some task that is different from what you normally do. So let's walk through how to do this. So first, to do any sort of editing of your tasks within TimeSolv, you go under Time and Settings. Then you have both your task codes and any subtask codes. And by the way, everything I'm going to show you is basically the same when it comes to expense codes as well. So under Expense and then Settings, same thing. We have expense codes, okay, and so on. All right. But we're going to focus on the task codes for time. So we're going to go to a task code here, and by default, when you're using TimeSolv Legal, you have all of the official ABA task codes that are used for leads billing. You don't have to use them. You can certainly delete them. You can build your own task codes that you use internally for your firm, whatever it might be. But in this case, we're just going to go with our general ABA task codes. So if you want to change the rate for a specific task, let's say asset display, or no, let's do like something that's easy for me to remember as we go through this. Let's say for non-working travel, you always charge a different rate. So you want to actually click on the link here under code, what the code is, okay? So non-working travel, we're going to click on that. And this is where we could edit all sorts of things about this task code. But more importantly, this is where we can set the rate. So we could set the rate either hourly or by the task itself as a block. So like, it doesn't matter when you do a time entry, it doesn't matter whether it took you a half hour or 5 hours, you're going to charge $500 for it. That's when you would set a task rate. In this case, we're going to say it's an hourly rate. So if it took them a half hour to complete this task, it'll go to half of whatever the rate is you put in here. If you did 5 hours, it would just do the math and so on. So let's just say that our rate that we charge for non-working travel is a lot less. We only charge $75 per hour for completing that task. And we're going to hit save. And you can see it shows up here under the rates, okay? Now, you need to make sure that for any client or matter, and if it's all clients and matters, then you need to do this when you're setting up your client and matter rates. If you know you're going to charge different rates for tasks, you need to make sure when you're setting up the clients and matters, you set it appropriately. So what you do is under the client and matters area, when you're clicking on, let's do this Friday test. And you have your rates, okay? By default, you have timekeeper default. If you know you want to use these custom task rates, you would then choose task, then timekeeper default, or task, then any global rate you might have, or any specific matter rate you might have. In this case, we're just say task, then timekeeper default. Okay, and you could do that at the matter level as well, and you hit save then. So this would be a good practice. If you know you're a firm that's going to be doing this a lot or all the time, just every time you create a new client in matter, you got to set the rate by task, then timekeeper default, global rate, matter rate, whatever it might be. So now when I come in here and create a time entry for this Friday test, so I'm going to click, Friday test, Friday matter, and I put in the task code of non-working travel. Notice right here, right now my default rate's 150. If I did this right, it should change. Oh, it didn't. Why is that? I hate when that happens. It should change for me. Oh, you know what? I bet I know why. I think I didn't just save it. Or I might have it, make sure at the Friday matter level. Yep, here we go. I'd already created a matter. So here's what happened here and why that didn't work. I set it at the client level. I set the new task, then time default at the matter level. But for any existing matter, it's not going to override it. It's still going to go by whatever you use when you set up that matter. So now I need to change it here and save it. So again, that's a good exercise that if you're going to change the rates for an already existing client, it won't retroactively update all the matters underneath there. You have to go to every matter itself. So now when I go here, this should, let's hope it works, right? Let's go to travel and let's see if this 250 changes to 75. There it is. It changed. Okay. So now when I entered that rate, it automatically brings up, or when I enter that task, it automatically creates that $75 an hour rate. Okay. Now you can get, like I said, you can get super granular with this, and you could decide that, man, for this particular, matter, I want to edit, I'm doing tasks then timekeeper default, but for Mike Hegman, when he does travel, non-working travel, that rate for just this particular matter is going to be $50 or whatever it might be. I mean, it can get super, super granular. You can do that here. You could also do it under the time and settings. Go back under task codes here, and you notice where it says edit rates over here. You could go over here and edit the rate here for specific timekeepers. So you'd only bring up any matter that you'd assign task, then something. So let's say this one. It's already going to show Mike Hegman at $50 an hour because I just did it over at the client level, but I can do it here. I can say, hey, for me, I'm going to have the rate be $60 for this specific matter. So this is what I'm talking about. You can get so granular in TimeSolv. You can almost get yourself in trouble in some ways by setting the rates this very specific. But if that's what your firm does, we have the flexibility to make that happen. Okay. Okay, so we are almost 45 minutes in. So I'm going to ask if anybody has any questions. Again, you should see at the top of your screen when you have those various circles, there's one that looks like a dialog box, if you will. Click on that and you should be able to enter any questions that you might have for me. So I'll give everyone a quick couple minutes to kind of think about questions. In the meantime, if you do have questions that I can't answer, or just questions in general, just always remember you can email support@timesolv.com, or you can call us at 1-800-715-1284. Support with TimeSolv is always free. You can always book a support session with us, with any of our staff. You have an account manager that was assigned to you when you started with TimeSolv. That person also can do any support session with you. And it'll be that way for life. So if you want more training, if you have new staff that has come on board, we do specific timekeeper training where we will specifically run through just how to be a timekeeper. A lot of your people who are just timekeepers, they don't need to know all of the things about how to generate an invoice or how to set the client rate or whatever it might be. It's not their job. They just need to know, how do I enter time and what are the tools I can use to enter time, things like that. So please use our support to the maximum of your ability. We're here to help. We want to make sure we're an extension of your business. Okay? Because this is no fun for, especially if you're a small firm and you're doing it yourself. There's only 2 or 3 attorneys and you're doing it yourself. You didn't go to law school. You didn't get into business because you love billing day. You got into it because you want to practice law. You want to run your business, whatever your business might be. And if you're not a lawyer, if you're some other business that tracks time like this, billing day shouldn't be a dreadful day. And let us help you get past that dread, okay? I don't see any questions in the chat, so I guess I must have done a good job of covering everything today. So I'm going to wrap this up. We're at 45 minutes, just past 45 minutes. So again, I will send a recording of this session via email either later today or sometime tomorrow so that you can review. It'll be at our website. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the year, a great holiday season. And mark your calendars, like I said, for the second Wednesday in January. That would be January 10th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So for that, I will say goodbye, and we'll talk to you next year. Bye, everybody.